All right. Hi, everybody. I am going to begin, and hopefully you can see my screen and my voice is okay. Please let me know if you cannot hear me okay, because I just have these new headphones and I want to make sure they work. All right. So hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is Sana Ziagmai. I am an Iranian American. I've been living in the US for approximately 20 plus years. And I have spent the last few years of my life working pretty closely with refugee communities. So this talk today is going to be discussing the framework in which I work and my experiences working with them, and particularly in the context of trauma-informed yoga and support groups. So I'll share some insights from this work and focusing on how we can create trauma-informed spaces that are truly inclusive and healing for those who have endured immense hardship. So a brief overview of the presentation. Today, we're going to explore the integration really of trauma-informed yoga and liberation psychology as powerful tools to support the refugee communities. When most people think of trauma-informed yoga, they often focus solely on the body. And while I certainly do incorporate physical practice into my classes, my approach really centers more on critical self-inquiry, collective care, mindfulness, strengthening communities, all of which align with yogic principles that we will discuss. And these principles honestly just emphasize critical self and collective inquiry. And it's centered to approach the conversations around whether it's individual struggles or collective struggles from a place of non-harm, from a place of compassion for self and other, from a place of non-judgment, and ultimately creating a space for care and truth to be told in a group community setting. Throughout my talk, I will also be talking about the classes that I've held. I have worked specifically at one refugee camp and then in various other spaces with the refugee communities, both here in Philly and in London, and of course in Greece. And my talk is going to be referencing these yoga classes that I taught. And these classes were always 90 minutes long, and they consisted of 45-minute talk and then 45 minutes of yoga, the physical practice of yoga. So in my talk today is mainly offering insight into the framework and approach that guides my work and using yoga in community as a tool for activism. And throughout this talk, I will also share some case studies from two 8-week yoga series classes that I held at the refugee camp in Greece. And I specifically worked with Afghan women. I do want to be clear about that. I only worked with Afghan women. And because I speak Farsi, many of the people in the Afghan community do understand Farsi. They speak Farsi, but they also speak Dari, and they also speak Pashto. But for the most part, a lot of the Afghan refugees that I worked with spoke Farsi, so I was able to work with them and speak in Farsi. So that was a really key aspect to my work, was that we didn't have a language barrier. Okay, so before I get into this, and I'm sure a lot of the other speakers have talked about it, but I just want to make sure I also acknowledge it. I feel like it's crucial that we acknowledge the scale and interconnectedness of the global refugee crisis right now. The trauma and displacement experienced by refugee communities is truly inseparable from the sociopolitical systems and conflicts that fuel them. And so understanding these concepts and the context of the systems in which we are navigating in and being shaped by, it's key to creating trauma-informed, inclusive support spaces. So just to put it into perspective a little bit, like this chart shows, this graphic shows, 1 in every 69 people globally will be displaced due to conflict, persecution, or human rights violations. And another thing I wanted to share was from the UNHCR Global Trends Report. One of the things that was mentioned while I was reading these reports was the majority of refugees that are arriving in the US currently today, like I think as of June 30th, 2024, are coming from countries facing long-term conflict and instability. So that's Democratic Republic of Congo, Afghanistan, and Syria are the top 3. And more importantly, the impact, well, not more importantly, but equally important, the impact on vulnerable populations, particularly children, is devastating. And just the other day, Save the Children released a statement which said that the occupied Palestinian territory is now ranked as the deadliest place in the world for children, with about 30% of the 11,300 children identified that are killed in Gaza have been younger than 5. And Gaza currently has the highest rates of child malnutrition globally. And that's just staggering. So these numbers really represent more than just statistics. They are lives, they are newborns and families, they are entire lineages of families, entire communities deeply affected by conflict and displacement. And so this is why trauma-informed practices that center ultimately liberation psychology or a liberatory framework practice are vital for supporting mental health and well-being of these communities. We really must do better. We must work harder towards offering a pathway to healing and restoring a sense of safety and dignity. Oops. And then finally, one last thing I wanted to say was I have to acknowledge specifically the horrific violence and ethnic cleansing that's currently unfolding in Palestine and seeping into Lebanon. As we work in mental health, and I'm sure most of us here do, supporting marginalized immigrant and refugee communities, if that's our focus, we must recognize that centering sociopolitical perspectives is not an option. It is, in fact, essential to our work. Liberation and feminist psychology reminds us that wellness is not just about the attainment of inner peace. It is the absence of injustice. It is the absence of inequity. It is the absence of harm. And to ignore these realities is truly to miss the mark on what it means to be well. So our advocacy, support, and compassion must extend beyond our borders, beyond our communities, from Palestine and Lebanon to Iran, Myanmar, Sudan, the DRC, all marginalized and oppressed communities suffering at the hands of patriarchal dictatorships. So it is our duty to show solidarity with those that are most impacted by systemic violence and advocating for their collective well-being and ensuring that our work reflects a deep commitment to justice and equity for all. I actually came across this quote that's written here by Leslie Priscilla. She's from Latinx Parenting. That's her website, latinxparenting.org, I believe. And she wrote, if your advocacy for mental health does not center the most marginalized, the most exploited, the most dehumanized, then it is incomplete. Okay. So these are just a few struggles, I would say, for lack of a better term, that are often tied to the refugee identity when one gains that status of refugee identity. So here are just a few: erosion of trust, displacement, of course, persecution. They are robbed of their dignity, autonomy, disconnected from their homeland. I think a lot of this was covered in some of the previous sessions, but I just wanted to share this to kind of like highlight what it is, in fact, that they may be carrying when we are faced with them in the support spaces that we hold. Sorry, I'm having trouble going to the next slide. Okay, there we go. And I did want to point out that, yes, refugees, of course, experience a significant amount of trauma, particularly anxiety, depression, PTSD. However, not all refugees have PTSD or are struggling with symptoms of trauma. And I think it's really important for us to remember that when we're working with them, to not assume anything. They are obviously human beings first, and no matter their experience, they, like all of us, like everybody, carries innate and accessible protective factors that naturally promote healing and healing through trauma specifically. So some of these protective factors are having a strong family network and having a strong community of support, cultural and spiritual practices, financial stability, of course, access to education, sense of purpose and meaning, supportive social networks in general, and then adaptive coping mechanisms. These are just a few. Of course, there's a lot more, and I'm just trying to highlight really that our role, regardless of the context in which we are working, supporting the refugee community, I truly believe that our role is to acknowledge these protective factors first and foremost. These protective factors help build resilience and support them towards healing. And our role is to maybe engage in dialogue that reminds them of those protective factors that they may already have in place, remind them and support them in possibly reconnecting to those protective factors. And then a lot of times the trauma and the experiences that we're having can be so overwhelming that we forget that we don't, seek the support that we may actually have. So it is important that we reconnect them with these tools, all while teaching new tools through the healing spaces that can complement their existing strengths. And that's kind of what the work that I was doing and that I am doing with the refugee community through the trauma-informed yoga healing spaces. So one book, I have a few books referenced throughout this presentation. One of the books that I just find deeply supportive and resourceful and just a great book overall is by Stacey Haynes. She's the author of The Politics of Trauma. So I highly recommend, if you have not read this book, to definitely pick it up. Research shows that practices that enhance self-awareness and self-regulation, such as yoga and other body-based practices, and also contemplative practices like meditation, are effective in treating trauma. Stacey Haynes explains that trauma robs us of our sense of safety, dignity, and belonging. And I think we've all heard this before. I think the whole conversation around belonging has become a central theme in a lot of spaces that are discussing refugee, migrant, displaced community support, is to find ways to rebuild that sense of belonging or restore. So it's important that we emphasize these three core needs in the healing process. And as a trauma-informed facilitator, I prioritize creating spaces that really foster meaningful connections beyond the individual therapy, beyond the Western model of individual therapy, recognizing that healing in community is incredibly powerful. So using a group format for the classes that I lead and a liberation framework, we can nurture a refugee sense of belonging through the intentional questioning that we do. And I will share some questions, some prompts that I may offer to the community. All right. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the foundations of trauma-informed yoga and the foundations of liberation psychology and kind of how and why I decided to kind of blend them together. I should also say that this was taught to me by my trauma-informed yoga teacher. Her name was Catherine Ashton, and she recently passed away. So a lot of my teachings are from her. So liberation psychology, uh, founded by Ignacio Martin Barro, plays a key role, honestly, in the work that I do. And mainly because it addresses and I guess really prioritizes the socio-political contexts that shape trauma when speaking about healing and healing in communities. So liberation psychology is not an approach that seeks to understand and address the psychological sorry, I don't know why I said is not, is an approach that seeks to understand and address the psychological impacts of oppression, violence, and social injustice. Ignacio Martin Barro was a Jesuit priest and a psychologist in El Salvador. And it was around the 1970s, 80s, he developed this approach in response to the extreme political repression, violence, and social injustices that he was witnessing in Latin America. And he argued that traditional psychology often failed to address the socio-political realities of oppressed populations, focusing instead on individual pathology without acknowledging the broader context. So in my work over the last few years, I've really witnessed firsthand how the power of storytelling and collective healing can transform a community. And this also echoes in Ignacio Martin Barro's belief that, as he says, to heal the wounds of traumatized people, it is essential to recover historical memory. And so that's, the collective consciousness, really, and talking about the history and the struggles of the oppression that they've faced. As the retelling of stories helps individuals reclaim their dignity and power to shape their future. He also emphasized that true liberation comes not from individual change, but from collective process of conscientization. It's always a hard struggle for me to pronounce that word. From a collective process of conscientization where oppressed communities come together to critically reflect on their shared experiences, build solidarity, and act to transform the unjust structures that oppress them. And so in these shared spaces that we would hold, that were centered on both self-reflection, collective reflection, and movement, the women found healing not just at an individual level, but also through that community dialogue and just that community engagement that was built across the 8 weeks. I ultimately ended up holding 2 8-week sessions within like half a year period. And all of this work, as you'll see, does also align with the tenets of yoga. Okay. Whoops. Okay. So now a little bit about yoga, trauma-informed yoga, the difference if there is. So the reason I say if there is because the Western world has really, I don't know, stripped yoga of its roots, really. The approach, and that's one of the reasons I believe that trauma-informed yoga in the West has become more popular. It was started in the early 2000s in an effort to provide supportive healing spaces for sexual assault survivors. And I think this was the most likely a reason. It was due to the fact that the Western world has stripped yoga of its roots and of its teachings of collective care, of community, of self-compassion and compassion for others. Because the spaces for yoga spaces in the West have really become central for like able-bodied, thin, flexible, you know, people who have a really strong foundation in like exercise and it's just it's not the core of what yoga is. And centering safety, centering autonomy, and centering individual and community empowerment is not a priority for generally for most yoga classes in the West. I mean, things are shifting now, but back in the early 2000s, it definitely wasn't this way. So trauma-informed yoga actively aims to minimize harm while prioritizing choice, consent, empowerment all over the importance of mastering physical postures. So the ethical tenets, just a few of them. So that's why I say, yoga, I think, is deeply in and of itself trauma informed. But then the West came in and kind of stripped it of its like philosophical principles. And so then survivors of violence, mental health professionals, community activists realized there's something missing. We need a space where folks can really tap into the power of yoga while building community. And so then I think they developed trauma-informed yoga was kind of birthed because of the stripping that the Western society had put in place. Traditional yoga with its ethical tenets, for example, these are just a few of ahimsa, which is non-violence, non-harm, satya, svadhyaya, self-study, which I usually say is that critical self-inquiry piece, asteya, karuna, which is compassion in action. It's a little deeper than just compassion. It's a lot more deep of a concept than compassion itself. What else? So all of these ethical tenets and philosophical principles that really guide yoga center ultimately that collective healing and address social injustices and work towards the liberation ultimately. Okay. I wanted to just take a quick pause and see if anybody has any questions. I have a lot of content to go through.
And feel free to raise your hand and I can unmute you if you rather speak or place into the question and answer section.
Thank you, Gwen. Okay, I will continue, but please feel free to interrupt me if there are questions. I don't mind at all. So, like I was saying, trauma-informed yoga, I feel, is truly a return to yoga's true essence. Yoga isn't just about personal peace and physical fitness. It's a powerful tool for collective resistance against oppression and genocide. This is a statement from Susanna Barkataki. She wrote this actually just a couple days ago, and I felt called to share it in here. So again, she says, it's not just about personal peace. It's a powerful tool for collective resistance against oppression and genocide. Yogic tenets call us to interpret harm wherever we see it. And so let's use our practice to cultivate compassion, awareness, and activism. She is also another great resource. I would highly recommend her training. You can find her, I think her website just goes by her name, Susanna Barkataki, and her name is in the slide too. And also this textbook, I have a chapter in there. This is a great book if you want to learn more about how yoga has been used in different communities by different yoga teachers and practitioners really across the world. I think it was released in 2022. Okay, so and when we talk about trauma-informed yoga and just generally in the mental health world, I think these days we often hear people use the word safe, safety, and safe spaces. And I'm not sure if this was mentioned in the other talks, but I just always feel the need to highlight that when we use the word safe space, um, we have to be very mindful because safety is not something that is just created because of the space holder's intent. Safety is co-created through trust. It's co-created through a consistent presence in a respectful setting that honors the individual and the community and the culture and their humanity and their dignity. So safety is ultimately an embodied experience that is felt. So we have to be very mindful when we say, join us here for a safe space, in a safe space for a yoga practice. I mean, I just, you know, I personally have stopped using it, and I'm just being more mindful in the wording that I use. So I'll say, um, a goal for our class is to co-create a safe space where we can blah 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 blah. So that's kind of how I word it. So yeah, I just wanted to highlight that as well. All we can do, honestly, is aim to collaborate with the community that we are serving to co-create those safe spaces in the end. And specifically for refugees, when we talk about the refugee community, it's important to remember that trust has been severely eroded by their experiences of violence, of persecution, displacement. So it's crucial to establish a physical and emotional environment where they feel respected, where they feel valued. We have to be very mindful of the language we use, our tone, our nonverbal cues, which I'll get into shortly. So the rest of the pillars of safety, there's of course choice, consent, and autonomy. Encouraging choice and autonomy by using language that invites rather than directs. So that's like not just for when we're teaching the actual physical yoga practice, but even when we're doing the group dialogue. It just our entire philosophical approach, really trauma-informed approach, needs to be centered around choice, consent, and autonomy, and making sure that we're providing that. And then empowerment, of course, the goal in these classes is to help participants really reconnect with their own bodies and the way they know how, and with our guidance. And if something doesn't feel comfortable to them, they don't do it, or they don't, they basically listen to their bodies, and that is the number one priority. And we encourage movement, allowing students to move freely with their bodies as they need. So if they want to, during the asana practice, which is the physical practice of yoga, during that practice, if they're not doing what we're doing or what I'm guiding, that's actually celebrated, it's encouraged, it's important to actually even celebrate it. One of my teachers, Zabi Yamasaki, she also talks about it. I'm going to share some of her points as well. Here, I think it's the next slide. So this is her book that was released last year, I believe. She added, I'm just sharing some snippets of suggestions that she shared about how to create a trauma-informed space. In addition to the language and everything else mentioned in the other slides. A few key points that I thought were interesting to note was like supportive lighting options. Sometimes, for example, during Shavasana, which is like the final pose, the final resting pose, people may turn off the lights, and the lights were on the rest of the time. I would ask before doing something like that. or maybe just don't do it. Or, you know, it's important that the students know what the class is going to be like from the very beginning, the minute they walk into that room till the minute they leave. So turning off the lights without anyone's consent may be triggering for some. And then empowering an invitational language, of course, always invite rather than direct. Consent framework for assists. So if you are a yoga teacher who wants to assist, there's assist chips that you can buy and offer in your class where all the students can get, and they can either flip it up or flip it down, and one side says yes, assist, the other side says no. Or you just say from the very beginning that you will not be offering assists. Oops, my screen just went blank for a second. Okay. And there are a few more. Okay, I'm going to move on because we are short on time. So I'm not going to get too much into the why and how yoga is helpful for the body, but I just wanted to highlight some key points. Both trauma and resilience land in our bodies. Trauma is held in the body and it leaves this residual somatic state. And we end up accessing those memories, those sensations through our memories. And so in the yoga classes, when we have conversations, which is like the first half of the session, I'm constantly reminding students to check in with their bodies and notice. Just the only prompt is to notice what shifts, if anything does even shift, or if they even feel anything, because sometimes there's also numbness, and I will also highlight that. And so one of the key points, key teachings, I should say, is teaching that, you know, our pain, physical, emotional, spiritual pain is held in the body, and that the resilience is also held in there. And so when we start seeing shifts in our experiences, when we start feeling a little bit less angry, or we start feeling less activated, or we notice that we're not feeling as overwhelmed as we used to, that is also a sensation that we're feeling, like that lightness that we're feeling, or that the release that is felt, that is also a somatic experience. And so reminding and teaching and kind of inviting students to notice what that feels like, and what it feels like to not carry that burden that they were carrying a few months ago, for example. And the more we can like really tap into those sensations and feel them and be in them, it can teach our body to kind of embrace it more, and find ways to re-access that feeling as well. Oops. Okay. So, whoops. Okay, the mind-body integration. So the research highlights the positive impact of mind-body therapies for self-regulation and resilience building. Basically, the point here, and which is what I aim to provide in my class, is using both a top-down and bottom-up approach. And the top-down approach means, like, you know, from the brain to the body, where we're talking about like using our mind and really just focusing on thoughts, feelings, sensations, and maybe talking about it, journaling about it, or even the practice of meditation is somewhat of a cerebral process. And then we also blend in the bottom-up approach. So that's the visceral somatic communication with the brain. Sorry, there's a typo in there. So the benefits of integrating yoga into a support group format, and with a liberation psychology lens. Sorry, this slide is also part of the mind-body aspect. The benefit is that we create a really comprehensive approach for healing. that respects and responds to the complex needs of the refugee population, or really any marginalized population. But using that liberation framework psychology with specific prompts that I will talk about now, and incorporating the mind and body and reminding students to really pay attention to their shifts in their body, if any, it kind of, in my opinion, makes it a very like complete methodology for addressing trauma. Because also they're going at it at their own pace, while they are encouraged to also acknowledge the broader sociopolitical contexts that contribute to their traumas. Because these are hard conversations, and it's important that we as service providers create spaces where they can have those conversations, excuse me, where they can have those conversations and just be heard. And oftentimes you will see, or at least I saw, that they would share things that they've probably never said before about, for example, patriarchy, because that was a topic that we talked about, I would say like a handful of times, but the few times that we did talk about it, they were incredibly powerful. And so it's all happening in this space of community while blending in the awareness of, okay, what's happening to my body? How can I, what can I do right now with my own body to gain a little bit more control over this feeling of overwhelm that's coming in? It's just I think it's a great combination. And central to this is in this last line that I wrote about storytelling. There's that quote that shame dies in places where stories are told. And that is really central to the this theme of how I find trauma-informed yoga support groups supportive for refugees. It's because we're creating spaces where individuals feel safe to share their stories, and we really dismantle the isolation that trauma often builds. And this is particularly vital in refugee communities, where and the storytelling becomes a really powerful tool for healing and for reclaiming their dignity. Okay, so I have some stories or short like quotes from the women, some of the women, and one of them is a man, that I interviewed after my classes. I did hold one series of classes for men, but I only ended up teaching 3 classes because nobody showed up. I had one consistent person that was coming, and I interviewed him at the end of my time there, so I have a snippet from him as well. Anyway, I just wanted to say, do you want to take like a quick break, or are we not going to take breaks? Should I just go on?
I think you
Because
can
I'm
go on. There
okay.
is, when you have a chance, there is a question in the question and answer that's sort of general. So when we get to a breaking point, I'll share that with you.
Okay, great. So this, I'm going to read a quote. It's somewhat long, not really. Her name is, well, it's not her real name, but we'll go with Neda. So she was a 27-year-old Afghan woman. This was at the refugee camp, just for some context. And she had arrived at the camp probably like a few weeks before I got there. So she was fairly new refugee, if I'm not mistaken, at least to that camp specifically. So she attended the sessions, and after one of the classes, she approached me outside of class to share her experience. And this is what she said. So she wrote, this was a recorded interview that she knew, and I had her consent, and she knows that I'm sharing this. So she wrote, she said, the Taliban martyred my brother. 9 months later, the Taliban attacked our village and overtook everything. We fled, left our homes, and emigrated. Ever since my brother's martyrdom, I forgot about myself entirely. I had lost all hope. I had lost the desire to live. And yesterday, when you asked us to listen to the sound of our breath, it was the first time in 2 years that I felt alive. I heard my breath, and I realized that I have been living out of my body since his death. You and the yoga reminded me that I have a body, that I can breathe, and that I am alive. After I met you, I found myself. When I am feeling uneasy or upset, I go to the breath that you taught us, and it calms me down. I also continue to practice the postures you taught me. As long as I am alive, I will love yoga. So Neda's experience, like many others, illustrates really how um, the breath and the body awareness and just the practice of yoga and mindfulness can really help people reconnect to the their physical and emotional selves and their pain and their suffering, and really like find subtle but yet very powerful ways to shift through these places of tension and constriction or numbness and disconnection. So yeah, I just wanted to share that one. There will be 2 or 3 more shared throughout. So the facilitator's role when holding these spaces. Our role is to facilitate a space where participants can reconnect with their bodies and explore their own healing process. I can't emphasize that enough, that participants are ultimately the experts of their own lives and their own experiences. I am not the expert. And it's interesting because in the Afghan culture and also in many other collectivistic cultures, they would see me as the expert. And I think I briefly came into Rebecca's talk, and I think she was talking about it. But they would always actually refer to me in Farsi as Ostad, which means expert, in a kind of means expert. And so they would always refer to me as Ostad, as expert. And whenever somebody would say that to me, I would remind them, I would thank them for that, reference or that using that title, but I want them to kind of practice not seeing me as the expert and practice seeing themselves as the expert. Like that was truly a consistent conversation, probably in every single session I had, because there was always new people in our classes. Working at a refugee camp, it's never going to be a consistent closed group of people, closed support group. It's always going to be open. And so one thing I found myself doing a lot was telling them that they are the experts of their own lives. And it was a little bit foreign to them. And at the same time, I noticed that it was also very empowering, maybe not immediately, but over time, you would see the shift, or at least I would notice the shift. And they stopped calling me that. I would always ask them to not call me that. So what else? So be aware of and speak to your power, your privilege, your positionality, especially being that you're an outsider. I mean, most likely you're an outsider. Um, I would just say for me, for example, a little snippet of what I did was, so I'm Iranian. The Afghan culture is very similar. I consider the Afghan community like siblings in a way. But I know that it's not necessarily, and I'm obviously not speaking for all, or but I know it's not reciprocated. And because unfortunately, the Iranian government, the Islamic Republic of Iran, I mean, um, is incredibly harmful to the Afghan refugees that reside there. And Iran has a large, large population of Afghan refugees. And they are treated like second-class citizens. They are entire. There's deep, deep. What's the word? Just shame around being an Afghan in Iran. You're looked down upon. It's the inequity is really tangible, and the discrimination is rampant. So me being Iranian and being in a refugee camp that was at that time majority Afghan community members. I mentioned that I told them like my background, where I came from, where I lived, all of that, and that I do understand the complex circumstances in which Afghans face living in Iran, and the way in which the government treats them. And I just acknowledge it in those kind of conversations. I acknowledge it and I let them know that, that this is where I'm coming from, and I would love for this to be a part of the conversation. If they are uncomfortable with me being Iranian, please speak to that and like let me know. So it's important to make everything transparent. And it's also that includes about your privilege as well. And so me being an outsider, I was living outside of the camp. I was like staying at an Airbnb kind of, so I acknowledge that I don't reside in the camp. I commute, I take a train and I come in there, and it's that those were all like ongoing conversations that were had as well. So invite participants to engage in community dialogue, share skill sets, and of course avoid hierarchies. Remember that you are there to support, to guide, and possibly be like the leader of the space, maybe, but that's not even always the case. Sometimes after a few sessions, when there was a consistent group of people, I would ask if one of the other women wanted to begin the discussion, or I would suggest a theme topic. And if they want to talk about it, then like I would ask someone else to lead the discussion. So I was always trying to like make it that, it's not just me always leading. Obviously that's if that's accessible. That may not always be the case. So, okay, so body-based and mindfulness-based practices. Oops. So breath awareness, body awareness, grounding techniques, paired with themes of self and collective inquiry, and then also rituals for consistency and familiarity. Sorry, I need some water. 1 second. So with the breath, it's really important to remember that not everyone feels comfortable using their breath as a tool for calming the body. A lot of times if the person is guided into breathing a certain way, it can feel overwhelming, and or just generally just uncomfortable. So always point that out, say that, this is, if breathing practices don't feel supportive, use their sensory practices, like, that body awareness, or inviting a body scan. I don't guide the body scan. I may give an example one time of like how I would do a body scan for myself. So I'm kind of like telling them like what's going on in my mind as I'm doing a body scan. And I encourage them to do that for themselves. And obviously, like throughout teach the physical practice of the yoga, I do every now and then, invite folks to, pay attention to this part of the body or pay attention to that. So they do hear how I, suggest that they go from one place to the next. And I just really encourage them to do it for themselves. So it's not an outsider guiding them to do it, but them practicing doing it themselves. And if the breath doesn't feel comfortable, they don't access that. Or maybe the sound of breath is better for them to pay attention to, rather than the the feeling of the rise and fall of the chest, that can be a little overwhelming perhaps, but the sound, you like have a natural breath pace, your normal breath pace, and you're just trying to hear the sound. That can be a little less overwhelming for some. I'm going to move on to the next because of time. So the class structure. So, sorry, I'm trying to find the space. Okay. When it comes to setting the space, obviously it's important to be mindful of cultural backgrounds and of course trauma sensitivities, and working in a refugee camp was, that's probably for another conversation in and of itself. But in any way you can possibly minimize harm and increase accessibility to like exits, and increase their feeling of autonomy while while you're setting the space, that can be very helpful. For example, like one of the rituals, for example, that I would do was I would ask the women, not always, but we did this for a few weeks, to pick, because we were in a camp, and there's wildflowers like random places. And so I would ask them to just gather some wildflowers and bring them into the space. And so we would put them in the center. And that became a ritual just for a few sessions. And other times I would have a candle. And they all, like one time I forgot to bring the candle, and they all, wanted that candle. And so these little moments, you'd see that, oh, we have this like little, really small, like shared experience where we're like coming together, we're starting the class, and we're kind of doing something together to kind of initiate the experience. So the rituals are important because that provides that consistency, and that consistency ultimately will lead to feeling safe and feeling like, okay, we can trust this space and the people here. And then closing rituals I would always end and actually begin with a grounding practice. And by grounding, would just be like asking them to, bring their awareness to their bodies or to the sounds and to the space around them. And then the other closing ritual was that, after this was towards the ending, usually when people would speak, after they shared something that was like heavy, I would invite everybody to do a collective breath together. This was something that was taught to me by Catherine Ashton. So we would just take a pause and we would thank her. I would just thank her on the group's behalf, I guess, and say, thank you for sharing. And then we'd all take an inhale and an exhale together. And it was in those moments where you could feel this deep sense of reverence for the space that we're in, because we're taking a moment of pause to acknowledge what that person just shared with us. And, these small moments and these small practices and rituals truly do chip away at isolation and chip away at shame, and foster a sense of community and a sense of belonging, I should say. It's more accurate. Whoops. Okay. So the themes, beginning the, like, how I say we talk about liberation psychology and we talk about like collective or like systemic struggles. I never begin with that. I would begin with themes of, when I say theme, I mean it was a prompt for each day. Like every day we would have a different topic. And it would begin with, for for example, joy, despair, resilience, boundaries, um, anger. And what does that feel like? Can you like think of a time where you felt really angry, and what did your body feel like? So I'm always bringing it back to the body, or for the most part, always. What did that feel like? What came up for you? And then like what happened? What did you do? And then everybody else shares. And so we're always teaching, or through our stories, we're hearing that the stories of how the mind-body connection is so powerful. And how did they end up calming down? What did they end up doing that brought them back to a little more place of calm? And how that impact their mind and their thoughts. And so these are all although you're just having conversations about different experiences, I'm also through the questioning, we're reminding one another that this interconnectedness is really strong, and that we do in fact have a little bit of control over some aspects of our emotional state, some, not all. And I will get to the aspects that we don't have control over, because I feel like that's a big part that can sometimes be overlooked. So we have that structured group dialogue, and then, yeah, as I mentioned, okay, so then the yoga practice. Always everything is, for my classes, it's gentle, slow postures. Sometimes there's like dynamic movement where we move back and forth in a posture with the breath, kind of following our own natural breath pattern, not like the groups. I'm not guiding, I'm never accounting for them or anything like that. I always normalize modifications, whatever they want to do, celebrate it, in fact, and encourage it. And honestly, in the end, I always emphasize that there is no right or wrong way to move our bodies. And the goal is not perfection, but rather awareness. Um, and yeah, so I'm going to stop there. I have another story. Does anybody have questions, or should I continue? What time is it? 2:30. Okay. I have a little bit more to go. Gwen, do you have a suggestion?
Yeah, there is a question. It's kind of general, not specific to yoga. I don't know if you want to take that now or wait for the end.
Okay, I will wait then.
Okay.
I'm gonna read the story about another person. Her name, we'll say, is Yusra. So she's a 48-year-old Afghan woman in the camp, and she has 8 children. So this was after I interviewed her. She said this: I had never heard of yoga before. I was seeing a psychologist here in the camp, and he suggested I try it out because I was not doing well. Excuse me. After a few classes with you, my psychologist told me that he noticed a drastic shift. I used to go to my therapy sessions and cry the whole time. It was like I had a lump in my throat, and it was very hard for me to utter a word. My tears would just fall. I did not know this lump existed until you asked us to pay attention to our bodies. I stopped crying after 3 or 4 classes with you. I can comfortably speak to the psychologist now. I share my struggles, I talk things through, and I believe that the lump dissipated because of yoga. So yoga allowed Yosra to really release stagnant energy from her body, and it provided a space, it provided her an environment where she could access her emotions by working through that physical barrier. In our final class, she learned that she was beginning to notice that parts of her body, she was beginning to notice parts of her body that she hadn't felt in a long time. I've actually heard that one many, many times. And so she said, I had never felt my lower back until that class. Now I notice how stiff I am in my body. and my jaw when I sleep. But now I breathe deeply and I feel lighter. So again, this is a powerful reminder of how trauma-informed yoga practices can really gently and safely reconnect people with their bodies. And it honestly, like, it provides us like an anchor for the healing process. So about the prompts that I had mentioned when we're talking about systemic issues, because prompts about, you know, feelings of resilience or stories of resilience and joy and despair may be a little bit different. But I always would try to make it a point to take it to that, from the micro to the macro. So in the first couple of weeks, the focus is on the mind, body, and inner world per se. And then we shift it to stories of hardship. And as a group, we pause and reflect and observe if and how our bodies shift. And through these sessions, we explore the different ways our bodies respond to different emotions and experiences, allowing them again to recognize their own somatic responses to a range of feelings and situations. So as the weeks go on, we take this understanding to the macro level. From the individual to the collective, we begin to talk about how the systems around us, whether it's people, institutions, or broader societal forces, how those systems and their impact manifests in our bodies. And by acknowledging both the inner, the interpersonal, and the sociopolitical influences on our somatic experiences, participants begin to deepen their understanding of their bodies in relation to the world. So my goal is always to remind them that while there are tools that allow us to carry some level of control within our bodies, we must also recognize that there are many things that are beyond our control. Unfortunately, suffering is all too often, for many, inevitable in this present state that we live in, present situation that we live in. And we can unite in our hardships and share our skill sets with one another, share our strengths, share our stories of that are rooted in fear and shame. And all of this will allow us to strengthen as a community, come together with a renewed hope to just be empowered as a community and fight against the systems in place that are causing us the harm. Because honestly, as you know, we all keep talking about, the healing happens in community, and that practice and move towards fighting against systemic forces that are harming us happens through collective forces. So the prompt specifically, here are a few examples. So reflecting on stories of resilience, that's a good way to kind of, I've found it's a good way to kind of guide people into that, the level of the macro. So for example, can you share a story from your life or community that speaks to your resilience in the face of systemic challenges? So exploring social identity. How has your social identity, for example, your gender, your race, your religion, ethnicity, impacted your sense of belonging or safety? Unpacking power dynamics. How have your power imbalances shaped your understanding of justice? And understanding silence and voice. Reflect on a time when you stayed silent about an injustice or found the courage to speak up. That this last one or not the last one, the Understanding Silence and Voice is probably one of the most popular ones in the classes that I would lead, because there would be lots of times where women would speak up about times they stayed silent. And just sharing those stories in and of themselves is deeply powerful. Okay, so I'm trying to be mindful of time. It's 2:40. We have 10 more minutes, and I have a little bit more to go. I guess we will go and do another story. Or maybe not. I'll cover this and then I'll go to the story. So, understanding the refugee identity. I mean, I think we talked about this, but I just want to touch on it a little bit more. The term refugee is often used to describe individuals who have been forced to flee their home countries due to war, persecution, or natural disasters. But it's really important to recognize that this term is not just a descriptor. It carries significant sociopolitical weight. And being labeled a refugee often implies marginalization, it implies exclusion and a loss of identity beyond the single story of displacement. And this identity ultimately impacts how individuals see themselves and how they are perceived by others. And so many refugees struggle with the dual burden of both coping with their past trauma while navigating social dynamics, new social dynamics that they're experiencing in their host country, oftentimes being deeply othered and seen as an other. So addressing the sociopolitical context of the refugee identity also means understanding the narratives that these individuals carry. When we provide space where their stories are honored and heard, we confront the shame and stigma that can arise from being seen only through the lens of displacement. And selective empathy and othering, I want to touch on this just really quickly. An important issue to address is this selective empathy that we are seeing in the world today. We've seen it forever and we continue to see it today. Some may say it's a more gentle word for racism, but I don't know. It's more of a descriptor of like what's happening internally to that person. So selective empathy, it basically occurs when certain groups receive more empathy and support based on their ethnicity, nationality, or religion, or other identity factors, while others are overlooked or even vilified. So an example, I mean, there's many examples, but the one that just comes to mind is Ukraine refugees versus Afghan refugees. And, the horrific war and the conflict in Ukraine is just devastating. And it's been so beautiful to see the Ukrainian refugees being embraced by countries all over the world, including Philly. And I just didn't once hear or see any fear or, worry or concern when the Ukrainian refugees were coming to the US. But when it's another ethnic group, for example, the Afghan community or any, honestly, a community of color, it's different. It's not celebrated. It's not the country, meaning the US, we're not, or the cities are not necessarily excited about it. Now, I'm not talking about obviously like Hayes and NSC, like you guys are very welcoming to the refugees, but that's part of the work that you do. But the communities as a whole, you don't see that. There is clear selective empathy for refugees of color. versus white. And so I just feel like it's important to point that out because when we as mental health providers are working with refugees, white refugees versus refugees of color, there is a difference there. And it is important for us to know that and be aware of that. I came across another quote again from Leslie Priscilla, who's from Latinx Parenting. She said, if you care about the clients who look like you, think like you, pray like you, or vote like you, then you don't really care about anyone's mental health at all. I like her work because she's pretty blunt in her quotes. Okay. I have a little bit more, but it's just really the closing. I don't want to overwhelm people and want to make room for questions. I
And
will
we do
provide.
have a couple of
Okay.
questions, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
Sure. So there's one that's very specific to yoga and one that's general. So I'll start with the specific to yoga since that's what you just spoke about. Kat Grossman asks, could you share a little bit about the style of yoga asana you practice? Do you do more yin or hatha style? Are there specific poses that you stay away from?
Oh, okay. So for hatha yoga, I teach hatha yoga practices. I'm really eager to teach, get a certification in yin. But I do feel that yin, it requires like staying in postures for a very long time. And I don't personally feel like that's a good idea, but I don't know. It really depends. Um, a bit because it's also like pushing the boundaries a little bit. So, I think all forms of yoga would be great. I personally teach hatha. And again, I would highly recommend Zabi's book, the one that I referenced, the one with the blue cover. She goes in detail into poses, and it is an excellent resource. But just to give you a few examples off the top of my head, some pretty like basic ones that are, not the best to use would be, for example, happy baby pose. I'm forgetting the name in Sanskrit. Um, you know, poses that are like exposing a little bit or maybe like makes people feel a little too vulnerable. Downward dog, I always do downward dog. I feel like it's an essential piece of the yoga practice. But when I'm like teaching that, and also throughout the entire class, really, I'm suggesting and saying like, if something doesn't feel comfortable for you, don't, do something different, or I'll give suggestions. Um, I'm trying to think if there's anything else that comes to mind. Oh, with Shavasana, like the closing, the final resting pose, um, I always give options because sometimes people may not feel comfortable just lying on their backs, just exposed and their arms down on the ground. And, it's a very vulnerable position. And then, oh, I should also say, it mentioned it in the slides about closing eyes. Like eye closing is always optional. But for the final resting pose, I give 3 or 4 options from the start always. So I say like you can try this, or maybe try, sleeping on your side, or maybe knees up and like knocked knees, so like your knees up and inwards, so your legs are like relaxed. Um, and or sleeping on your front. So I always in every single class give multiple options for Shavasana. Mm, yeah, I would really recommend Zabi's book for poses to avoid. I'm sorry, I can't think of anything else off the top of my head.
And then we have just one final question. Do
Mhm.
you have any thoughts on cognitive behavioral therapy with refugees and people seeking asylum, people with trauma? I have heard conflicting information about CBT. Some people say it's helpful, others say it ignores societal factors.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yes, I think it is. I think you can use CBT if you're strict, while using other factors, other theoretical approaches, and acknowledging the larger society as a whole, acknowledging things that are beyond our control, acknowledging that I do agree with the person who said that, and I don't really go to CBT because I mean, I do sometimes, but it can really be a very siloed view. And then I feel like, particularly with the refugee community, they're just going to feel like, we don't understand them. We don't get it. Like, because it does seem very short-sighted. Um, so yeah, I agree with whoever was asked that question, that I don't find it that is helpful. It needs to be integrated with other frameworks. Like, you don't have to be strictly CBT focused.
Yeah, yeah, we always
Yeah.
say, take what works and leave the rest
Yeah.
behind, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Like in a certain situation, like just because they carry that refugee identity doesn't mean that CBT is not gonna always work. Like maybe if we're talking about them going to school and having like career making decisions and just random, less like larger systemic issue world challenges. CBT can be used for certain things and accessing like small tangible goals. Um, but we can use other perspectives and other frameworks for other areas of focus. So does that
well,
make sense?
yeah, yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Mhm.
Sanas, thank you so much for sharing your expertise today. And I'm sure people will have questions after the session. So anybody can email me questions and just let me know which speaker you'd like to send them to, and I'll be happy to forward them on. This is our last session of the day. So I really thank everybody for joining us today. And I hope that we can see you again next year.
Thank you. Thank you, Gwen, for inviting me. And will the participants be getting access to the slides?
Yes, so I will be sending out the
So I can,
slides as well as the
okay.
links to all recordings so that if of course, you were only able to go to one at a time. So I will be sharing all of that. And sometimes if you have other information you'd like to send out, just send it my way and I can include it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for inviting me and having me on this in this conference. I appreciate it.
Yes,
And
thank
if
you.
anybody has any questions or wants to, just have a conversation or collaborate or anything, honestly, I live in Philly and I'm always looking to connect and build my community and collaborate with more people and on new projects. So I'm open if anybody's interested in reaching out.
Great, wonderful. And thank you everybody for joining us today. Stay tuned for more information. If you're interested in CEUs, we do have them for the whole day. Just send me an email and I'll send you the information that you'll need to apply for that. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you.